offering incense to idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up in my arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness, with bands of love. I was to them like those who lift infants to their cheeks. I bent down to them and fed them. They shall return to the land of Egypt, and Assyria shall be their king, because they have refused to return to me. The sword rages in their cities. It consumes their oracle priests and devours because of their schemes. My people are bent on turning away from me. To the Most High they call, but he does not raise them up at all. How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, O Israel? How can I make you like Ammon? How can I treat you like Zebulun? My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender. I will not execute my fierce anger. I will not again destroy Ephraim, for I am God and no mortal, the Holy One in your midst. And when I will not come in wrath, they shall go after the Lord, who roars like a lion. When he roars, his children shall come trembling from the west. They shall come trembling like birds from Egypt, and like doves from the land of Syria. And I will return them to their home, says the Lord. And the New Testament reading is Luke 12, 13 through 21. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Friend, who sent me to be a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?' So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves that are not rich towards God."
Once upon a time, when my sons were quite young, the backyard of our house was surrounded by a 6-foot chain link fence. As parents, my husband and I were thrilled that the previous owners of the house had installed that fence. We felt confident that we could allow our little ones to play in the backyard, knowing they wouldn't be able to get into any trouble. The problem was, we didn't count on our younger son, Chris. Now, Chris, as a small child, seemed to constantly be looking for ways to escape from our yard. One day, he discovered that by standing on his tiptoes, he was able to undo the latch on the fence gate, push it open, and off he would go, usually over to his friend Adam's house. So, in an effort to outsmart our wayward child, my husband moved the gate latch to the very top of that 6-foot tall fence. For a while, that worked like a charm. Chris wasn't able to get out. But what we didn't count on was Chris's ability to outsmart us. One bright, sunny afternoon, Chris was calmly playing with his toys in the backyard, and I was working in the kitchen, still keeping an eye on him. Suddenly, Chris bolted over to the gate and began to climb up the fence. Before I knew it, he had shimmied up that fence, unlatched the gate, and with the weight of his body, he swung open the gate and climbed back down to the ground. He was free at last. I can still remember watching this entire episode in amazement. I stood at the kitchen door, transfixed by the determination of that little guy. Needless to say, Chris never quite got around to trying that trick again. That's all I have to say. He's still alive, so as parents, we try to keep our children safe and secure. We do the very best we can to help them understand that there are rules and limits. We love our children and want to keep them from harm. But the reality is that we can never quite manage to get them to listen to us all the time. I think there is something in each one of us that compels us to challenge authority once in a while. Yet when it comes to our children, we still somehow find it in our hearts to continue to love and support our offspring no matter what. The people of Israel just weren't getting the message. God was doing everything in God's power to protect and love Israel as a parent loves her children. The children being children, Israel was determined to escape from God's love and protection. Instead, they've begun turning to idol worship, believing that gods like Baal had all the answers, and the God of their ancestors who brought them out of slavery in Egypt was an old know-it-all who wasn't lifting a finger to help them. You see, when everything was going Israel's way, God was great. As long as God produced good weather and fat, healthy flocks, people were content to honor their promise to be faithful to God and stay at home. They had no reason to try to escape and run off. But when the rains stopped and the cows ran low on milk, the children of Israel decided to run off and look for greener pastures. You see, it was a whole lot easier to worship idols. With Baal, there was no dreary talk of commitment or honor or where were you last night. Everything was spontaneous. The people of Israel were free to do whatever they felt like doing. The only expectation was to do whatever felt best at the time. No one cared very much about anyone else. It was a me-first world. The problem was that Israel couldn't see herself as her parent God did. Needless to say, God was angry and disappointed. But rather than abandoning the children, God, the loving parent, tapped on Hosea's shoulder and called him to get the people turned around one more time. The words from Hosea we heard this morning are filled with anger and sadness. You could hear the pain that God is expressing through the prophet. So just what does God do about the situation? Is God's wrath brought forth for these wayward children? Does God react with hatred, vengeance, and retaliation? No. God does what only God can do. God expresses nothing but an unending love for the people. Just as parents continue to love and care for children no matter what happens, so too God cares for us. We have to admit that all too often we turn ourselves away from God's love. We reject the nurturing presence of God. We forget that God doesn't reject us, even though our actions often reflect our rejection of God. Once upon a time, there was a bank president who had two sons. The older son was a fun, loving, carefree sort of person, while the younger brother was a responsible, straight as an arrow type who always played by the rules. When the father died, the two brothers found themselves alone in the funeral home with their father's body. "You and I both know that money meant more to our father than anything else," said the older son. "I think the most appropriate thing for us to do would be for each of us to put $1,000 in his hand and let the money be buried with him. What more apt tribute could we pay to him?" "Of course, that would be appropriate," replied the younger, straight as an arrow brother. So the younger brother went off to the bank, got 10 crisp $100 bills, and put them in his dead father's hand. Later that night, when no one was around, the older brother came, took the $1,000 and wrote a check for $2,000 and slipped it into his father's hands. One day, a young man approached Jesus demanding that he pass judgment about his family's inheritance. You see, in those days, someone like Jesus, who was known to be educated, knowledgeable, and respected, was often seen as a mediator when arguments and disputes popped up. And so this man tried to get Jesus to pass judgment about the inheritance. But Jesus wasn't about to be drawn into a family feud. Perhaps this one man's brother is the same sort of guy our friend the check writing brother was, and his greed was getting the better of him. Or maybe the man just wanted to have whatever he thought he should have. A long time ago, the city of Columbus was caught up in something that became known as the Mall Wars. The dispute over shopping centers was carried on by Les Wexner, who I'm sure you've heard of, the founder and director of all of those limited stores, along with a number of other enterprises. Wexner's adversary in this dispute was the Glimcher family, wealthy real estate developers who had all sorts of strip malls and shopping centers around town. Well, life had been very good for both the Glimchers and Les. Indeed, they managed to accumulate a whole lot of land, money, and prestige within the Columbus community. But neither party was ready to sit back, relax, and enjoy their wealth. And at the time, the Columbus area, of course, was growing by leaps and bounds. These two developers recognized that there was a whole lot more money to be made by building their own brand new shopping areas so they could sell even more stuff and make more money. And so the mall war began. In the end, Polaris Fashion Mall, many of you know that, was created by Glimcher, leaving all of his other malls to deteriorate and die. Wexner built a state-of-the-art shopping and entertainment complex known as Easton Town Center. And he too abandoned other neighborhood shopping areas that were boarded up and emptied out. The Great Mall War is a story that may sound a little familiar to us as we examine the parable Jesus told about the foolish rich farmer who was filled with greed and the desire for glory. The story Jesus tells isn't a story for the faint-hearted. It's not a story about a pleasant ending where everyone lives happily ever after. Indeed, this is a very different story for us to hear. Yet, at first, we might not see anything wrong with the idea of the rich farmer. Here he was, already rich and choice. He just managed to get richer, sort of like Glimcher and Les Wexner. Anyway, this farmer's crops produced way more than he expected. And isn't that great news? It's wonderful when it's an occasion to rejoice and celebrate. Who among us wouldn't want to wake up in the morning with a whole lot more money in our checking accounts than we had the night before? farmer had a slight problem. Just a tiny dilemma. He couldn't figure out what to do with all his extra grain. What in the world could he do with all that wealth? Then, in a flash of greedy genius, the rich man came up with a perfect solution. I know just what I'll do. I'll tear down my old storage barns that are too small and build bigger ones. Then I'll be able to keep all the stuff I have and not ever have to worry about not having enough again. Life will be great and marvelous for me. No more worries. I've done a great job. Hooray for me. Now, up to this point, this rich man's idea sounds pretty good, doesn't it? We'd all like to have a wealth like that, just like having to find additional storage space for all the stuff we have. It's too bad the rich farmer didn't know about all the storage places for rent these days. He wouldn't have had to go to the trouble and expense of building his own. Oh, well, that's okay. He could afford it. Build his own barns. That way he could keep his eye on all his stuff and not worry that someone might steal something. And if that was the point of the story, we could all go home happy and pleased with all the stuff we have. But Jesus always has more to say. Just when we think we get the point, we find out that we don't have a clue about what Jesus is trying to teach us. This rich farmer didn't come home happy. He didn't even live through the night. I know that sounds extreme, but that's the story Jesus told. Now, I don't think Jesus told us this story to frighten us all into giving up everything we have. That's not it at all. As some biblical scholars point out, Jesus didn't hate things or possessions. Jesus didn't hate the good life. According to the scriptures, Jesus enjoyed the pleasures of good food, comfortable surroundings, and life in general. Indeed, Jesus isn't telling us to give up everything life or the pleasure of our buying power may bring us. Rather, the point Jesus is trying to make is that this foolish rich farmer was out of balance. All of his wealth and possessions kept him from understanding the real source of his abundance. Sure, he put forth a great deal of time and effort. I'm sure he worked very hard for all he had. And I'm sure he believed he was really deserved those riches he had. He feels justified in being very pleased with himself. Here's where he went off balance. He was so concerned about himself that he forgot all about God and he forgot about other people. George Callis, in his book, More Parables from the Backside, points out that our rich farmer